Coreel Lake on the Invermore fishery was just fabulous altogether for big sea trout. It was a long walk into it. Took you maybe an hour to get into it. You parked the car at Luggeen and you walked up over the mountain and you got to it, and there was a house out on the island on Coreel, and but any angler that used to fish Connemara in the old days, well, Glennick and Costello were very good, but for me that lake it just had a lot of big sea trout, 2, 3, 4 pounds or even bigger.
Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. For this week's episode, we're speaking to Paddy Gargan, the recently retired IFI fisheries scientist who has a wealth of knowledge about fish conservation, habitat restoration and stock numbers. Paddy talks to us about the huge changes he has seen during his career, as well as his own love of sea trout fishing, and he lets us know about a book he is currently working on detailing the sea trout fisheries of Connemara. Paddy is also asking for help from people with any archive material relating to sea trout in Connemara, be it photos, catch records, stories, maps, anything that will help him in researching and writing the book. So if you do have something that you think might be of help, you can send it on to him on paddyggargan@gmail.com. So that's paddyggargan@gmail.com. And Tom, I'm sure you'll have some stuff there that you'll be able to send on.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking of that, Dara. Oh yeah, how's it going? But I was thinking of that. And I was thinking, well, I wouldn't have a huge amount. I have a picture of me with my first sea trout from Lahaina in 1978, and it's huge. I don't think it's of much value beyond the Sullivan family house or beyond me, really. So there wouldn't be a huge amount. Unfortunately, while I did get to fish the sea trout locks back there, I didn't get to fish them that often. And by the time the collapse had come, and Paddy mentions it there, I was still young enough and didn't get a chance to fish them as often as I would have liked. So I'll still be rooting through things. I know there's a picture of my uncle with the big fish from Aina, picture there from that'll be back from the mid-80s. So I'll have a look for that. But anything else I come across, I'll see. But hopefully,
it's one of those books I would say do well because the Joe Crane episode we did, which was hugely popular. People have this grapher and harken back to the good old days, and any kind of pictures or books, anything that deals with it, I think will do well.
Yeah, I think they will. As you said, when we Joe on, that was a really popular one as well, because people love to hear about these places, and I think it's almost it's tinged with a bit of sadness when we talk about them, because it's what we had and what we don't have anymore. It's very interesting as well that because he mentions Coreel as well, and Coreel has popped up so many times. Popped up with Joe when we're talking to Joe. Popped up again, yes. And when I talk to other people, you talk to people who were lucky enough to fish it, they'll mention Coreel. It must have been a fantastic night. And as we said, the big walk into it. It's
like talking about the 1970s Brazil football team.
Yeah, no.
It's like, do you remember Brazil? Oh, do you remember back in the day? Oh, that was the football. That was the way football used to be.
That was the way it was, and that's the way it should be. Yeah, we'll never see it again.
Well, it was ruined by money. There's a lot of similarities, maybe.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities, actually. Yeah. I was going to say total football, but sorry, that was Holland.
Or soccer, maybe you should call it now.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. We really might digress in there.
How's the fishing been for you?
It's, as I said last week, with this heat wave that came in, it's been forget any daytime. I've done a bit of canis fishing in the morning, some success. Hasn't been fantastic up at this part of the lake. Hatches of canis have been patchy, and actually in this fine weather, particularly up here, it's been gas in the morning. And you wouldn't think it. A really strong northeasterly wind about 4 a.m. and lasts for a couple of hours, and then starts to go calm just when you want it to be the other way. But so that's kind of put a kibosh on it. Yeah, I got out a couple of times, and but that's been it at the moment. The weather's promised to cloud up again this weekend.
All that.
I'm actually out again now, so look, we'll see how it goes. Fingers crossed for it. But look, it's been a tough one. Talking to most people, and we are going to do a bit of a review on the mayfly across the country. But definitely, I know from here in Corb, it'll go down as
not one to remember.
Yeah, it's not been one to remember. It's been a toughie.
And yes, Sheelan has been great, and Arrow has been great, and we want to cover that probably next week. In terms of
and just talk. It's nice to get around. I mean, and I know it as well, Cara generally gets a lot of the kudos all the time. And, I suppose it's back to the old football scenario, I mean, Liverpool did finish in 5th this year, so you can't be top all the time.
I'm a Man United fan, so I'm just
and I'm lamenting the loss of our Champions League spot. But anyway, but you know what I mean. I mean, things vary, things change, and Garb did not have a good mayfly season this year. But like what we're hearing from reports so far, Sheelan seems to have done very well. Arrow seems to have done well. So it'd be good when we do that, just to get a bit of a roundup to see how it's been.
Exactly. So stay tuned for that, folks. But look, let's go back to this week's episode and Paddy Gargan. And obviously, Paddy Gargan has had a lifetime involved in fisheries, science, fly fishing itself, involved with the Galway Weir. We talked to him a bit about that. And then he had decades with Inland Fisheries Ireland. So it's really fascinating stuff Paddy has to talk about it, and then he also delves into a bit about his book as well, so well worth a listen. And I first asked Paddy to give us some of his background and how he got involved in the fishery science side of things.
Well, I grew up in Cavan. I suppose like most young guys, I went fishing for pike and perch on the Erin catchment, and then as a young teenager I went to Loch Sheelan, which isn't very far away, and I had an uncle, a priest, who used to bring me to Sheelan, but I didn't realise it was to go on oars, to put them over rising fish, which was a great experience. But I got into fishing Sheelan then, and with my interest in fishing, I went to UCD and I did a BSc and a PhD in fishery biology. And I was very lucky then in early 1986, Ned Cusick was retiring from the Galway Salmon Weir, and I got the job as manager of Galway Salmon Weir in 1986. I did that for 5 seasons. And then in 1990, Ken Whelan was leaving the Central Fisheries Board to go to Burrishoole to the Salmon Research Agency. And the position came up of a salmon and sea trout biologist in the Central Board. And I was lucky enough to get that. And I continued in that for the next 32 years until I retired last year. So I've only been working really with the state fisheries since I left university.
Well, that was a potted history in 1 minute. Well, brushing over your many achievements and what you've done. So I'm going
to come to that later, I hope.
Actually, just before we get into Ned Cusack, wasn't Ned he only died recently? Was it last year?
Yeah, he died maybe a year and a half ago. Yeah, he was. Yeah. I think he was 102 or 103.
And he was still catching salmon up until his last days.
He has the distinction of being photographing in Trout and Salmon magazine at 100, where he had caught 2 salmon on the salmon weir at 100. Yeah, yeah,
it's phenomenal. Yeah, it's. I wanted to try and interview him. But it just didn't happen, and I was just thinking, God, the stories and the memories, what he would have had. Like, what was he like as a character?
He would have negotiated the purchase of the Galway fishery from John Barber in, 1978, and Ed was the man that negotiated that purchase.
That's right. It was a private fishery until then, wasn't it, Paddy?
Oh yeah, it's a private fishery all along until pressure came to open it up, and Ned approached John Barber, and he initially had a very high figure because it included the commercial eel fishery and the commercial salmon fishery at the traps, and Ned reduced down the price. I could be wrong, but it's reminds me of something like 220,000, something in that range anyway, and Ned got the deal done, and then Ned became the first manager after the state purchased the fishery. Yeah.
What was that like working on Galway Weir?
Oh, it was fabulous. But you see, at that time it was we were commercially fishing for salmon at the traps. There was a big eel fishery operating, and the angling fishery along the river operating, and drift nets were still going on at the time. So we used to patrol out Galway Bay. There was a sanctuary area between Spiddle and Blackhead that the nets weren't allowed to come inside, and so that was difficult to police because the nets would drift in, or they'd let them drift in, and we had a lot of snatching going on off the bridges at that time too with the salmon, and then we had a lot of illegal netting for eels up the lake, up in Corrib, Lower Corrib. So there was a full-on business. The commercial salmon fishery started on the 1st of February, and the angling finished at the end of September, and then the eels were going right through the winter. So it was.
Tell me this, Paddy, when you were there, were the boxes still in operation?
Yeah, the traps in down in what we call the middle bank between the Samware Bridge, downstream of the Samware Bridge. Yeah.
Could you explain how they operated?
Yeah, well, there's a fascinating history of the Galway fishery in the watchtower down at Wolftown Bridge. There's the old fishery watchtower there has a history of the fishery. But very briefly, the boxes have been there. We know all the owners of the Galway fishery since the Norman times, since about 1260, and all the major families in Galway over the years, and the various monks and major families owned the fishery at one time. But there's traps on either side of the river, and there's what was called a Queen's Gap or a King's Gap in the middle that had to be left open at all times so that there would be a free passage for salmon. And it was like an in-scale. The salmon swam into the box, which was shaped upstream, and they're facing upstream. So they couldn't get out once they went in. They were because of their swimming upstream, they were kind of trapped in each of the boxes or the cribs, and they were fished fairly hard from February until the end of July, 6 days a week, and it was quite amazing at the time. I'm sure we'll come to talk about the salmon runs, but if you think the drift netting was happening at sea, then the boxes were being fished, and then the anglers were fishing above that. So there was a lot of salmon around at that time.
What was the run like back then, Paddy?
We don't know, because the counter went in around 2007, but we estimate now that the run is somewhere around 15,000 fish a year on the Corrib. There's a counter in the fish pass in the centre of the weir, and we reckon about half the fish go up the fish pass and half go up the gates. So whatever the run through the fish pass is, we double, and that has been as high as 22,000 in the last 10 years and down to about 12,000. So it's probably averaging 15,000. So back in the 60s and 70s, when marine survival was much better, it probably was 3 times that. And then you have to think of all the fish that were taken out before they reached the Corrib. So I'll come on to this later, but marine survival in the 60s and 70s, when the experiment started, you tag so many smolts going out and you see what percentage of them return. It was 15 to 20% marine survival. And in the last 20 years, it's 5%. So it's taken a big drop.
So the run was 45,000 probably, you reckon?
It could have been. I mean, yeah, you'd have to say if the run at the moment is averaging 15,000, there would have been a bigger run when marine survival was higher. Yeah, it may not have been as high as that, but it was bigger than it is now. Yes.
Wow.
Some numbers.
Some numbers. So that commercial fishery, Paddy, must have been quite lucrative.
Yeah, it was. There was up to 2,000 fish being taken annually, and they were sold to the hotels and to the smokeries, and it was lucrative. Yeah. And the eel fishery was probably even more lucrative, because I remember the salmon, commercial salmon fishing stopped, I think, in 1999, and the eel commercial fishing stopped in 2009. But I remember back in the 80s, a ton of eels, silver eels, was worth about £4,000 at the time, which was very very big money, and you may end up catching 3 or 4 tons in a night. So that was financially very, very rewarding.
The eel numbers, I know people talk about salmon and they focus on that, but the eel numbers have been decimated by, was it 98%, they reckon? Yeah, well, the elver runs, or the small eels coming in from the ocean, are only about 12% of what they were before 1980. Right. And of course, the question everybody asks is what's happened. But
See, different to salmon, eels are like one spawning stock. Eels from Norway and from Germany on the Rhine or all across Denmark, France, or whatever, they all go to the same place, the Saragossa. So they're one spawning stock. So if you have heavy metal pollution in Europe and you have dams on the rivers in Norway or even in Ireland, and you have overfishing in certain places, then your spawning stock is greatly reduced because it's the one stock. And then we had this parasite, swim bladder parasite, was introduced from the Far East, Anguilla parasite, and the eels, their swim bladder was infested with this parasite when they were swimming towards the Saragossa. So you basically ended up with much reduced spawning stock. And then when those eggs hatched, they just drift back on the currents. They could end up in Iceland, or they could end up in Morocco or in Ireland. It was, so because of all the problems that they had trying, the spawners getting out to sea, the whole numbers were reduced. So therefore the numbers of small eels coming back is greatly reduced.
It's a fascinating species, like, isn't it? That we don't know so much still. Like,
I have heard recently, but it's all like anecdotally, that there seems to be an increase in the number of eels. Is that so?
Yeah, I think it's nothing like back to what it was, but the number we monitor, or IFI monitor 7 or 8 locations around the country where they monitor algal returns, including the Corrib in the salmon weir, and there is some increase in the numbers, but it's still, you may be getting 15% of the runs that you had pre-1980, But policy across Europe now is to stop commercial fishing and do everything, and recovery plans. There is a recovery plan for eels, but that's going to take quite a while because they're long-lived species. Even in a rich, productive catchment like Corrib, they would be 18 to 20 years old before they would leave to go to spawn.
Wow.
And just tell me, in terms of the Galway weir, number of anglers, Paddy, when you were there, did it increase over time, decline over time, kind of remain steady?
Oh no, I think it remains steady because there are 6 at peak time. There are 6 anglers allowed on each session, so you can't increase that, and there's always a big demand for fishing spaces, especially when the growths are come in the end of May. Yeah, so I think the numbers have stayed the same, but there's probably overall, the Galway weir is a very high demand location, but I think everybody knows overall the number of anglers fishing now is a lot less than it would have been maybe 20 years ago. Yeah.
And just one thing I'd like to ask there, Paddy, once it was switched over into the state's hands, did it make it more open? Did it become more open for people to fish?
I think so. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It was a private fishery. And one of the issues was that, locals didn't get access to the fishery. And when the state took it over, they had a policy of, trying to, make it generally available to as many anglers as possible. And it certainly did. It changed from a private fishery to a public fishery owned by the state. Yeah.
Although it's still as hard as it to get onto I believe. It's like winning the lottery trying to get onto it sometimes.
Yeah, well, of course, it's only 6 rods in the morning and 6 rods in the afternoon every day. So that's, it's still not a lot of space,
the demand,
high demand, yeah.
Yeah. It's actually somewhere I haven't fished. I used to spend all my summers down in Galway. My mum's family's from down there, so I know Galway very well. And I remember even as a kid walking by it, and you'd just be fascinated standing on the bridge, just watching the anglers there. And it's just, even talking about it now, God, I'd love to be back down there just visiting it. Like, Tom, did you fish it much?
No, I've only ever fished it, I think it's twice. But just what you said there, and I think Paddy will agree with me as well, for anybody who's never done it, and if you're in Galway and it's the summer, go to the Salmonweir Bridge and look over.
Just get an ice cream and walk down.
Yeah, it's as much an experience as walking down Quay Street. But to sit in the salmon weir and to see everybody pointing out the fish and then pointing them out to the anglers who can't see them, it's fantastic. Yeah. No, I've fished it twice, but as you know, my penchant is trout. I was there once, Paddy, and I was going down step and cast and everything, and some trout started moving inside me. Right, and there was 1 or 2 good trout, and it was killing me that I couldn't nip up to the rod and get the get the 9-foot 5-weight or 4-weight and have a go with them. But no, it's a lovely fishery, and it's amazing. No more than the Ridge Pool and the Moy to be, in the centre of a town and fishing away.
It's a very, very special place. Actually, just the Watchtower, I've never been in. Is that open to the public?
Yeah, I think it's. I was speaking to someone who said it was due to open recently for the summer again. Yeah, and it's fascinating because it has the history of the ownership of the Galway fishery since Norman times in 1260 or something, and Richard de Burgo was the owner, the first documented owner we know about around that time, and then there's old photographs and exhibitions of there used to be a big draft net fishery down there, and there was a draft net fishery in the Long Walk. There was a platform out in the Spanish Arch there in the river, and interestingly, there was a salmon caught there, 69 pounds in 1866, and the owner of the fishery at the time, Thomas Ashworth, the fish used to go over to Billingsgate, up on the train and over to Billingsgate, and when that fish got to Billingsgate, he asked for a cast to be made of it, and the cast came back and he presented it to the university in Galway, and it's still there in the Martin Ryan building, the cast of that 69-pound fish. Yeah, and recently we've got a carving done of that fish, and it's now up in the Anglers Lodge in the Samware. The fish was caught in 1866.
I think we'll have to do an episode, Tom, on the Galway Weir sometime.
Yeah,
I think definitely well worth it. So, Paddy, from the Galway Weir, you obviously kind of cut your chops there, and you went into the IFI. Then was that a real kind of? So, tell me about the kind of focus of your job there. Was it science, research?
Yeah, it was science and research. But that was in 1990, and I was mainly dealing with salmon and sea trout, and my good friend Martin O'Grady was the brown trout man. And right throughout the 90s, a couple of things happened. We'll talk about the sea trout and the salmon farming in a moment. But with the salmon, the drift nets were going ahead unrestricted. There was no quotas. And I suppose for 10 years, we were trying to get the department and the powers that be to establish conservation limits for salmon. So in other words, you needed a certain number of fish to spawn in a catchment, and you should achieve that before any fish are killed. And leading up to the late 90s, we started looking at, with the help of Phil McGinnity in genetics in UCC, we started taking samples from the drift net fisheries and the draft net fisheries, and we had gone round all the rivers looking at taking fin clips of salmon in each river. So we knew the genetic signature of each salmon river. And then when you get a scale of a fish from a drift net, you can trace it back to its home river. And a lot of the work at that time was showing that the drift net fisheries were mixed stock, that they were taking fish from a whole load of rivers, including rivers way below their spawning capacity. And so we were very lucky then to establish conservation limits on the rivers, and then the government decided to stop drift netting in 2006 and go with the new policy of you've got a conservation limit. Each river, depending on the size of the river, obviously a small river in Connemara might have a conservation limit of 1,000 fish, and the Corrib might have a conservation limit of 10,000, depending on the size. And then the challenge was to try and work out whether the conservation limit was being met. And that was done in a number of ways. There was about 30 fish counters put on rivers, but the angling catch was a big step, because with rivers with counters, we knew the run and we knew how many fish were caught by anglers. So if you had 1,000 fish in your run, and the anglers caught 150 fish of that 1,000, then that was 15%. The anglers were catching 15%. So we knew that from rivers with counters. Then we could say, and there would be a range around that. We could say if we got the right catch from any river, we could estimate the total run, and we could judge where that total run was above or below the conservation limit. So that was a large part of the work at the time to move to single stock management and then assess whether rivers were meeting their conservation limit. And we ended up since 2006 maybe with 40 rivers open for harvest with a quota. If for instance the conservation limit is 5,000 fish in the river and we estimate the run is 7,000, then there would be a quota of 2,000, and that would be above what's required to spawn. So, that policy has been in place since 2006, and there's about 40 odd rivers open for catch and release because they're not meeting the spawning requirement, but they're probably close to it. And then there's about 60 mostly smaller rivers that are closed because they're well below the conservation limit. So I suppose that whole thing changed in my career from no limits on catch. And we used to say, let the drift nets hammer them, let the draft nets, wherever they were, take them, let the anglers take them, and we hope enough get into spawn. And that was the way salmon were managed. And that was the reality. And we're now gone to a point where they'll be managed based on the spawning requirement in each river. So that was a massive change.
Would you, looking back on it now, so we've had probably 17 years of it.
Yeah.
Would you gauge it a success, or do you think it needs to be tweaked or improved upon? Or
well, what was happening in parallel to that policy change was the reduction in marine survival, because marine survival used to be 15 to 20% up to about 1980, 85, and then it started to decrease down to 5%. So there's less salmon around now, but you'd have to say if that policy wasn't adopted, you couldn't continue to have had drift netting operating now and, no restrictions on fish being killed, because at least, there's a chance for fish to recover now. They're only being exploited where there's a surplus. And while, it's all down to poor marine survival, the management policy means that fish aren't being killed where they're not meeting the spawning requirement, and they have a chance to recover.
Giving them a chance, really, in these, basically. Yeah. Just to ask you there, Paddy, probably hard to pinpoint, but would you have an idea of why there's a reduction in marine survival? Is there a main cause, or is it a combination of factors?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors. And we did some tagging. We put satellite tags onto salmon kells and looked at where they were going all across Europe. Guys did it in Norway and Denmark, in Iceland, and we did it in Ireland. And they're going to different places, but the Irish fish were going up north of Iceland, up South Greenland, up to the polar front, where the cold water from the Arctic meets the warm water from the Atlantic, where there's an upwelling. And the research seemed to show that polar front is changing and going further north, which means that Irish salmon will have to travel further north to feed. They'll be exposed to more predation. There'll be less time feeding, and ocean warming seems to be an impact. The more nutritious plankton species that were predominant have been taken over by a different plankton species. So the food web is changing as a result of ocean warming, and there's a whole combined effect going on there. But in Norway, it's interesting. The salmon have a lot shorter journey to go to the feeding grounds than our fish, because they go up to Svalbard and whatever. So their journey time to the cold water up there is a lot less, and they're having a better survival. But I think it's just a whole combination of factors in the sea. It does seem to be marine survival, not freshwater survival, that's the main driver of this.
Do you find that very frustrating when you were working in it, Paddy, in the sense of your hands were tied so much that you could do so much for freshwater, but yet most of the damage was being done out in the ocean? And
yeah, but I think it was a case of, you protect the habitat, and the management policy was, and the scientific advice was in place. Don't let any salmon be harvested on rivers unless there's a surplus. And, once that policy is in place, that's all you can do. And you hope then that marine survival will start to increase. But if you did anything else, you'd have a lot less salmon than we currently do have,
And one way of looking at it, I suppose, it'd be frightening to think what the numbers would be like if these conditions weren't put in.
Yes,
In 2006, it could be a lot worse than, I mean, people are saying it's not that it's rosy now, but it could be a hell of a lot worse than it actually is now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the case. Yeah.
What are the best conservation strategies that have been put in place, do you think, in terms of managing the stock numbers?
Well, it's simply the policy that if the scientific advice is, and we give advice on each of the 144 salmon rivers we have, and every year the scientific committee give advice on what the status of the stock is on each river, and management have gone with the scientific advice since this process started. If there isn't enough spawners, then the advice is don't have any killing of fish and have no commercial fisheries in the estuaries, and that's been very successful.
And what's the most difficult part, like in terms of kind of, I suppose, the prevention, shall we say? Is it, keeping an eye on pollution? What is it that you're trying to fight all the time?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of regulations now in European, water and directives, nitrates directive, and various management plans, and have been in place now to protect habitat, and there's been a lot of upgrades of sewage treatment plants, and a lot of issues that were caused problems 20-30 years ago are being resolved, and through better farming practice, and so there's quite a bit of regulation now in to do with water clarity and ensuring good water quality. The Water Framework Directive would be a big one there.
Yeah.
And in fairness, the Water Framework Directive, I know from having spoken to people, is like in terms of what it's done in terms of water quality and the kind of ramifications if you don't adhere to it. But do you think, like, we speak to a lot of people, say on the podcast, and you'd be speaking to people giving out about kind of in terms of from farming, in terms of what's going into the water, and then even we spoke to Pat O'Toole last week about the River Boyne and what Meath County Council gave in terms of the license to dawn meats. So do you still feel though we might have regulations in place? A, you have to enforce them, but B, how impactful are the consequences of breaking the regulations?
Yeah, I mean, there's always individual instances where you end up with breaches in the regulation, and you hear about it on various rivers. But I do think in general, because we had a policy of electrofishing a lot of rivers around the country every year to look at the state of juvenile stocks, and generally, the juvenile salmon are in a good state, and many rivers, and you don't hear about the big issues we used to have with silage runoff and all of that now. I do think that there's a lot closer look being kept at the water quality issues, and it does seem from the scientific committee when we were looking at it that the major problems for salmon are marine survival.
Can I ask you actually, Paddy, just on I think it was 40 rivers that are closed, you said?
About 60.
60. Sorry. Do you monitor their stock levels? How has that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because if you've got no counter in a small river and there's nobody fishing it, you ask the question, how do you ever get assessment of the river, or whether does it ever get opened again? But we know from electrofishing juvenile salmon that if you fish at various sites around the catchment for 5 minutes, and if you get an average of 17 salmon fry, you're likely to have had good spawning in the previous year. And we know that from rivers where we've had counts. And so on a small river, we do a lot of electrofishing. And if the average salmon density is over 17 fry, then that river gets open for catch and release. And that allows an estimate then of the angling catch to be, if anglers catch 15% of what's there, if you get an angling catch, you can work out the total run on the river, and you can compare that against the conservation limit. So there is a mechanism for getting small rivers assessed and potentially opened if the stock recovers.
And have you seen, like, when a river is closed, that because you're keeping an eye on it, that do you see a kind of is it an incremental increase? Like, I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, with the closure of it, how big are the jumps in terms of the improvement? Or does it come back to that marine survival that if it's...
Yeah, it does. You may not see a doubling of the run just because it's closed, because there may have only been 30 or 50 salmon caught on that river in normal times. So I think it's a case where you're letting all the salmon that return in, and you're letting them all spawn, and over a period you're hoping that will contribute to a recovery. And it may take 10 or 15 years for that recovery to take place, but that's the policy, that you're giving them the best opportunity. And there's also a lot of habitat work targeted at these small rivers that are closed. There's funds there under the Conservation Stamp Fund to do work on spawning gravel and various nursery areas in tandem with not taking any fish from those rivers.
How did you find, Paddy, in terms of, like, was the government proactive in terms of taking on board the scientific advice from you guys?
Oh, definitely. I was involved from all along up until 2022, and I can safely say that when we provided the scientific advice, it was taken on board, and that was it. If our advice was that the stocks are not sufficient on whatever river, that was the case. We never had any issues in terms of management. They always accepted the scientific advice.
So the only problem I have with this, right, and I've spoken about this before in the podcast, is you have the advice, right? Scientific advice is saying this, right? And we're talking about salmon catchment and salmon numbers, right? But then you have another government department where the policy is around aquaculture. And to me, there just seems to be a dichotomy going on there, in the sense of, it's almost as if one department is accepting advice, saying, and I know their remit is different to maybe where the aquaculture kind of industry comes on board, but then you have another department who seems to be, all hell-bent on developing more aquaculture, which we know is harmful to salmon and sea trout stocks.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, maybe if I can just go back a moment, I think your initial question was, how have fish stocks changed over my time in fisheries? And what happened in the late 80s was that salmon farming started to be developed, particularly in Connemara. And in year one of any of this production, the salmon are small. They're only, smolts or post-smolts. They're only, 10, 12 inches at the start. So they don't have a problem in the first year. But when they get to be bigger, 3 and 4 kilo fish in the second year, they do harbour a lot of sea lice, which gets into the environment, and the sea trout picked it up, and they have no protection, and they were coming back in what was called prematurely. They go to sea in May mostly, and they come back maybe in the first floods in July as these harvesters or finnock, about 3/4 of a pound, and they were coming back in at the end of May, early June, covered in lice. And so that happened in all of the bays where we had salmon farming develop. And then, of course, the stock collapsed in 1989. And, we spent most of the 1990s trying to prove the issue and sampling sea lice and whatever, on sampling sea trout for sea lice. And I've written many scientific papers on it. But, it's been a major issue. And you might ask what the solution would be. Well, certainly, I think it's easy to solve if the will was there. Move to land-based. I always thought there should be, small little units around Connemara, for instance, where you had recirculating tanks. You pump the water in, it's filtered. You could even have a wind turbine to heat the water to a certain degree. The effluent going out is filtered, and you have your production unit on land, and you have no environmental impact. You have no sea lice issues, you have no escapes, and you're providing employment. And I think that would have been, that probably would certainly, the move to land-based is very desirable to try and recover the sea trout stock in the long term.
Key word there you mentioned was the will. You're a scientist, you're an expert in this. You've mentioned the research papers. the science is incontrovertible around it, isn't it?
I would say so, yeah.
And
yeah, but you see, you've got to remember there, somebody who's involved in this question is the accountant.
yeah, but
And
you're
basically, it's more cost. So you're looking, I mean, all these, correct me if I'm wrong, but fish farms are private entities and they exist solely to make money. And surely the problem here isn't it, Paddy, that a land-based farm initially is more, it's costlier.
The initial setup costs are more costly, yeah. But I was involved in a conference with NASCO, the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation, about 2 years ago, where we looked at the cost, or got experts to look at the cost of establishing land-based, and it's actually not that much more expensive in the long term when you do have your initial expensive setup costs. But once you're in operation for a period, the costs start to level out, and surely we could have had some experimental or pilot schemes put in place, to show that it's a success, to see how financially more expensive it is or not, and to look at alternatives to these open net pens, which we've had since the mid 1980s, and certainly NASCO have called for a move towards land-based salmon farming.
I get so frustrated, Paddy. I'm not asking for an answer for him. Just maybe your insights into it is, on the one hand, you have sustainability. It's the buzzword. Government's talking about sustainability. We hear all the time about farming and emissions and how we're not meeting our emission targets, right? We have your work that was going on in terms of conservation, habitat, improving the salmon stocks as you could do it in the freshwater, right? So you had the government listening to that science. We have all this body of science, which, as you said, is incontrovertible around the damage that aquaculture does to salmon and sea trout stocks. And yet, on the other hand, you have another government department that willingly, and as I've been told, we've been led to believe that there's a scientific paper that was produced like 10 years or so ago that calls into question the actual damage of aquaculture. And they're using this one paper as the basis for their government strategy to justify continuing the policy of developing aquaculture. It makes no sense at all to me. And surely from a scientific community that's used to advising government, it must be I just don't understand how it makes sense, and that's the problem I have with it. Like,
yeah, I think you're right in what you say. It's hard. It's hard to. I said, well, we have one government department responsible for protecting salmon and sea trout stocks, and then we have a different department responsible for licensing and development of aquaculture. And all along we've never really been able to sort of come to an agreement as to what might be the right strategy to pursue. It's just been two policies been pursued in parallel without reaching any conclusions on the issue.
And why isn't there the will, do you think? Is it because of the supposed economic benefits that aquaculture brings?
Yeah, well, it's I don't know how to answer that one. There is a policy of development of salmon aquaculture, and
even though it's unsustainable and does damage, like that's.
It depends on who you're talking to in terms of whether they agree with that or not. But
even though 99% of the scientific community backs up with.
Yeah, you're touching a nerve there. But I suppose I certainly would like, and I know that IFI have a policy of moving to land-based aquaculture, and that's, if you want to look into the future and in 30 or 40 years' time in Ireland and in the West Coast, will there still be open net salmon farms, or will they have moved to, there's sort of halfway house between moving totally on land. They have these semi-closed containment farms in Norway where, there's no mixing of the water from the farm to the outside environment, so the lice don't escape, and they're sort of semi-closed, it's a halfway house there's plenty of technology going on at the moment to try and minimize the impact. But I would certainly hope that at some point in the future we would have moved away from the open net pen farming that we currently have.
I think you mentioned there frustrating, Dara, and I think to hear you saying that, Paddy, I think it's very frustrating. I find it very frustrating when you mention, land-based farms and that they seemingly could be the answer to all the problems, and you say that they haven't even been tried on the West Coast here.
No.
That's really frustrating. I find that. Yeah.
And the thing about it as well is, Thomas, I think, and again, you talk about Will, Paddy, is like and I think this is part of the problem, and we've spoken about this before, Tom, is the sustainability issue, the quality issue of, like, I don't eat any. I used to won't touch any farmed salmon now, any farmed aquaculture now, because there's no quality issue around it. We don't know what the quality is. But if we saw similar, like, again, I'm just thinking of farming and carbon emissions and all that kind of stuff. If there was a similar kind of light shone on the damage that's being done to the environment from the current aquaculture setup, you would hope to think that there would be some kind of pressure put on. And I think that's part of the problem. And we did an episode on the Salmon Summit a couple of months ago, Paddy, with the Icelandic guy from NASF.
Elvar.
Yeah, Elvar. And I think he made a good point, which is that out in the ocean, they're kind of hidden. Don't really see what's going on in the ocean. Whereas, you could be driving down through the countryside and you see farms, you'll see a river going through fields. It's a much more visible thing, so that if there is an impact, it's kind of easier to kind of do something about it or be engaged about it. Whereas I think that's part of the problem seems to be, it's out there, it's under the ocean. Don't really get to see
we said it was highlighted here before. If let's say the cattle industry suffered the same mortality rates that happen in the salmon aquaculture industry, there'd be absolute uproar entirely. But it's as you said there, Darren, and Paddy, it's kind of hidden from public view.
Yes.
Do you see at any European level, Paddy, like even just anecdotally from kind of conferences, did you see it? Like, again, I bring this comparison to how the EU was very quick to bring in banning the combustible engine from 2030. Like, they put in the law, that was it. It's happening 2030. Get your act together. It's not, do you see any kind of similar kind of moves afoot?
No, I think the EU recently in the last year, 18 months have begun a review of aquaculture in Europe. I don't think they've produced a report yet, but I think they have. Before I retired, I had some involvement there. There was a review being undertaken, but how much that will, transpire to individual countries. I mean, there's only Ireland and Scotland, I think, in Europe that have salmon farming. Norway's not in the EU, and it may be left to individual countries to manage their own industry. But I think the EU have begun a review of aquaculture.
Like, we talk about Connemara, sea trout fisheries there, like, too late in many respects, isn't it? And isn't that the danger?
Unfortunately, what happened was, and it was interesting, we put upstream and downstream traps on some of the fisheries like Invernmore and Gowla. And we, in some years in the 90s, we were only getting 12 or 15 of these finnock going upstream, and they don't really contribute to spawning. Of the eggs laid in sea trout fisheries, those harvesters of finnock only lay about 12% of the eggs. But in 3 years on, when the progeny of those fish would be going to sea, we were getting 5,000 and 6,000 sea trout smolts, which was impossible from 12 or 15 finnock that don't really spawn. So it showed that the brown trout in all these lakes had a genetic propensity to produce sea trout smolts, because they would have interbred with the sea trout over generations. And so those brown trout were pumping out sea trout smolts to some extent for a number of years. And then as the years went on, the smolt run, dropped to 2,000 or 1,000. And what we ended up doing was basically losing the migratory strain. And if you go out to Connemara now, there are sea trout still returning to some fisheries. It's not all doom and gloom, but in many of them, there's loads of brown trout in the lakes, but they've lost the migratory strain. And we wrote a paper at one stage to say how would the stock be recovered, and largely through straying, because sea trout stray much more than salmon. So if you did remove, local open net salmon farms, over a period of time, you would get strays from other fisheries, and you could recover the stock. But it seems at the moment in many of these fisheries that we've lost the migratory strain of trout to go to sea.
Well, I just asked you, Paddy, just off my own bat there. So I've heard the argument that a sea trout is a brown trout is a sea trout.
Yes.
Is that the case? Like you've been involved with them for so long, and you've managed fisheries, which we'll get onto as well. So what's your view on that statement?
Yeah, I think the literature you read will say that sea trout and brown trout can spawn with each other, or interspecies spawn. I mean, even if two sea trout spawn and their eggs hatch out, not all of those will go to sea. Some of them will stay behind, but they have the progeny of sea trout, and they will then maybe produce progeny that will go to sea. So it's a kind of a whole intermixing thing, and that's why that experiment showed us that even though we didn't, but the run of sea trout back into these systems stopped, we were still getting significant smolt runs from the ancestral stock that was there in the brown trout that had the migratory gene to go to sea. So that it would never be a case where, brown trout only spawn with brown trout and sea trout only ever spawned with sea trout, and every progeny of a sea trout went to sea and became a sea trout. That wasn't, that isn't the case, or wasn't the case.
That's fascinating what you say, that some of the eggs, or some of the progeny from two sea trout, not all of them will go migratory.
Yeah, and the other is that some of the progeny of brown trout will go to sea.
Yeah.
Do you remember, Paddy, the heyday of the Connemara sea trout?
Yeah,
fisheries?
I was very lucky because when I was in UCD, I got a call to say that John Prendergast had just taken over the Zetland Hotel, and would I be interested in running the Gowla fishery and then the nearby fishery, the Invermore fishery, for Noel Ryan in 1983, which is 40 years ago now. And I was delighted, and they were great fisheries, Gowla Lake and places like Coreel, famous sea trout fisheries, Lugeen and Invermore. And I was delighted, and I spent a number of years there, and that was before the sea trout stock collapsed. So that has been one of the reasons why I've decided to write the book, because I was there while it was still good, and would have fished other places around like Ina and Screeb and Ballynahinch and all those other fisheries there. So I think one of the things that drove me on through my career was having been there and knowing how good it was, and then having seen how it changed was a driver to try and get the problem solved. Any
particular favorite fishery for you?
Oh, I think that Coreel Lake on the Invermore fishery was just fabulous altogether for big sea trout. It was, it was full of islands and rocky shores, and it was a long walk into it. Took you maybe an hour to get into it. You parked the car at Lugeen and you walked up over the mountain and you got to it. And there was a house out on the island on Coreel. And but any angler that used to fish Connemara in the old days, well, Glennick-Murrin and Costello were very good. But for me, that lake it just had a lot of big sea trout, 2, 3, 4 pounds or even bigger. And of course, anglers probably took too many sea trout with them in those days, but then you had to carry your gear and your sea trout back down the mountain again to get home. But
I often heard talk of Coreel, all right, Paddy. I never got to fish it, but it was meant to be an absolute wonderful fishery. And it's interesting that you say there, because there was a big walk into it. But if anglers are willing to put up with a walk like that, I think it said something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you still fish it?
Well, I think that fisheries hasn't opened. Unfortunately, the sea trout, the numbers are extremely low in some of those Connemara. Not in all of them, but certainly in some of them. I don't think anyone is fishing the Invermore anymore.
And hence, I suppose, one of the reasons why you want to write this book, Paddy. Tell us a bit more about it. You're going to kind of look at the heyday of it, a bit of the history, the science, in terms of the kind of the rise and the fall, I suppose. Is that
I'm interested in looking at the old history as well. I've been reading some books from the 1840s and 60s where English anglers coming over and describing, the catches in those days, and some of them, like we got 67 sea trout on maybe on Finlock or Delphi or whatever. And some of these stories are amazing going back that far. So I'm going to hopefully have a history of the ownership and the fishing in the old days. And that's why I was putting out the call for anybody that has photographs or, old history of the fisheries or any interesting old photographs or catches of sea trout or anything that would contribute towards, getting the essence of what the sea trout fisheries in Connemara were like.
And I tell you what we'll do is we'll put an email address in the show notes. So if people listening do, so you're looking for photos, stories, any kind of archival material,
records,
anything like that?
Absolutely.
Records.
I'm hoping that this will end up being, if somebody says, well, what about the Connemara sea trout fisheries, that I'll have encapsulated it all in one kind of coffee table book where you can read your chapter on, whether it's Kylemore or the Clifton River or wherever, and you can leave it down and then I think it all will have to be tied together as well, the geology of Connemara and all of that. I mean, for instance, on the Corrib, we don't get a run of sea trout because it's such a productive lake that the sea, Corrib really is the sea for those trout, whereas in Connemara, they have to go to sea. Well, not all of them do, and they're mostly female fish that go to sea, and they produce their eggs, and then they're back in. So to put on any growth, they have to go to sea. So I'll be trying to sort of describe what makes Connemara and what tied them all together in geology and all of that.
It's very interesting because I asked you just before you came on, Paddy, because we were just chatting about it there. The number of fisheries, even like I was amazed. What do you reckon, like separate fisheries within the Connemara region? There's how many?
There's about 17 individual catchments, and then there's a couple of smaller ones that that also used to have sea trout. But there's 17. I intend to include at least 17 catchments.
That's amazing. And tell me, Paddy, have you fished all of them?
No, not all of them. But I suppose, like most people, you fish the bigger ones. Places like Costello and Screeb and Gowla and Inver and Ina and Balnahinch and those, Kylemore. And then there's a whole lot smaller ones, like places like Furnace, Loch na Furnace, Lettermacoo, Doohulla.
I fished Doohulla.
Yeah, and they're less well known. But when I've been reading up in the old days, they were very productive, those fisheries, and there's finding the descriptions of people catching very good catches in the smaller fisheries as well, places like Inverbeg and whatever. So any help I can get with information or whatever will be welcome.
I actually just mentioned there, when you're talking about old things, is there on the Screeb fishery, which was a phenomenal fishery, is there not a rock on one of the islands there on the lower lakes to a phenomenal salmon catch or something? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know.
I remember being told that there on one of the islands on, the lake that's the brackish one right at the end, that some guy had a phenomenal, I'm not going to say the number, there's something like 50 is sticking in my head, but that sounds crazy. But there's a memorial rock put up to him. I must try and find out. I think somebody told me back here once who was managing it once. I'm not aware of that now.
Well, it might be in the book.
Well, it might be in the book now. I'll have to go and look it up.
That'll be my job, Patty. I'll look up that for you.
I tell you, Paddy, good job you're retired now, because the amount of work you've got ahead of you.
That's a phenomenal undertaking, to be honest.
But I think it's going to be really popular, because I know from the Joe Crane episode where we were talking about the kind of hugely popular people, anytime we mention Connemara sea trout fisheries back in the golden days, there's a massive interest in it. And I think definitely a book like this would really capture people's imaginations. Before we finish up, Paddy, so you're retired now from IFI. Are you getting a lot more fishing done?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And where is it salmon you
Yeah,
still
well,
go
I live
after,
in
sea trout,
I
or what?
live between Galway and Moycullen, looking out over the lower Corrib. So I fish in Corrib a lot, and then when I get days in the Galway salmon weir, it's fabulous. But then I go to Connemara as well. I go to the Erif and Delphi and places like that, Kylemore. So yeah, and sometimes I just go along with friends who are fishing and just go for the day, So I also go up to the Own Moor and the Own Duff and Mayo, which is always very good.
One thing I want to say as well, you mentioned your uncle there, Paddy Gargan.
Yes.
Who's features he's on the video of Loch Arrow from years ago. Tell him the very good joke, actually. It's worth listening to that. But just to say to you, I mean, my dad, who's passed away, always talked really fondly of your uncle.
Yes.
And whenever there was a national on or anything, he used to love meeting up with them afterwards, because I think they might both have partaken of a couple of half ones after
Oh yeah.
it was on. And he really loved meeting up with your uncle. But he was well known in the angling scene, Paddy Gargan.
Yeah, he was famous, and he actually, I just can't think of the exact book now, but when I've been reading up, he's credited with bringing the Green Peter to Connemara to fish for sea trout, because he would have been fishing the Green Peter on Sheelan. And one author who I'll mention in the book credits him with bringing the Green Peter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But I'll just make one more comment when I'm talking about the old days. I used to work as a summer student up in Loch Furnace and Fia, and there was an old major up there, Major Robertson. This is going back to the brown trout and the sea trout, and he used to kill all the trout that we would catch. I'd go out fishing in the evenings. He'd kill all the small trout because he thought they were competing with the sea trout. But little did he know that those trout he was killing that were 7 inches long, many of them would become smolts the following spring and gone to see a sea trout. So it just shows you how times have changed,
a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
So, Paddy, everybody we have on the podcast, we always ask them a question, and you've been forewarned of this. So I'll ask you now, Paddy, what is your most memorable fish that you caught on the fly?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I've got big trout on Sheelan, for instance, but it would have to be Mort Folan, the famous angler and fly tyer in Galway, and myself were on Glennickmurrin Lake in 1987, and I got a sea trout, 8 pound 9 ounces, which I think is the record for the fishery. And we didn't realize it was a sea trout until it came into the boat. We thought it was a salmon, but it was 8 pound 9 ounces fresh sea trout on the 1st of July in 1987, which was the last really good year for sea trout. So, and it was good to have Murt's company in the boat, because you can imagine things were very colourful after that.
Yeah, I'd say he remained very quiet all throughout the whole proceedings.
Yeah.
What did you catch him on, Paddy?
A golden olive bumble.
Oh,
yeah.
His was more second favourite fly for Glennickmurrin. He preferred the claret.
Yeah.
Wow. And which beat did you catch him on?
Over near the lunch house on the island. Yeah, along the side of the island there. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
fantastic.
I don't think you'll be seeing fish that size for a long time.
Yeah, because that's one thing about Connemara. There was very rarely. What was the specimen weight? Used to be 6 pounds, wasn't it?
Yeah.
For sea trout, they nearly always came from Curran. So that was huge for Costello for mine.
Will it feature in your book?
Oh, I think there'll have to be a picture of me and Bert with that fish. Yeah,
definitely.
The only picture of me, I think. But yeah, it's worth putting that in.
Well, Paddy, thanks a million for joining us. Brilliant insights, scientific insights in terms of, your career and what's been going on in terms of the fisheries, in terms of aquaculture, in terms of conservation and habitat. It's an ongoing battle, and I think it's a fight that's even been having to be fought even harder, going forwards. You've done your job, you've done your work. You can step back now and do a bit more fishing and try and enjoy it a bit more, maybe. Right. With less pressure. So just to remind people, Paddy is looking for any photos, records, maps, anything, any archival material relating to the sea trout fisheries in Connemara for a book that he's writing. What's the best way to get in contact, Paddy, with you with that?
My email is paddyggargan, there's 2 G's, paddyggargan, GARGAN @gmail.com.
gmail.com, and we'll include that email address as well in the show notes and on the social media posts as well. But for now, Paddy Gargan, and I'm sure we'll catch up with you again, but thanks a million for joining us on the show.
Thanks a lot, lads. I enjoyed it.
Our thanks to Paddy Gargan for joining us on the show. And as we said at the start, if anybody has any material that could help out Paddy in his forthcoming book, there is going to be an email link that you can see on any of our social media sites where you can contact Paddy with that. Also then, don't forget to rate, review and follow the Ireland on the Fly podcast on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Plus, you can keep up to date on IrelandOnTheFly.com as well as on Instagram, and myself and Tom will be back with another episode about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland.